Welcome. It's wonderful to see so many people here this evening. Just out of curiosity, how many people are here for the first time? Can you raise your hand? Oh, okay, that's a lot of people who were brought out for this event, so welcome. And one of the best ways to find out about the interesting and exciting programs that we have here is by signing up for our email list or visiting our website. Tonight's program will be with Mr. Alan Hantman, who's here to discuss his book, Under the Dome. And we have Miss Jane Campbell of the United States Capitol Historical Society here to introduce him. Mr. Campbell will be signing copies of his books, which are available for purchase. So let's give a round of applause for Miss Jane Campbell.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It's an honor and a privilege to be here in front of you. My name is Jane Campbell. I have the honor to serve as the President and CEO of the United States Capitol Historical Society. And so it's extra special for us when we get to have someone who has so much information and experience with our precious Capitol tonight. We are also very grateful to be here at the Hill Center. I saw so many of you put your hands up as first-timers, and I want to give you a little bit of background. This building is the old Naval Hospital, which was in serious disrepair for a long time. And the neighborhood residents were very insistent that we figure out a way for the federal government to transfer it to the local government so that it could be transferred to a nonprofit to turn into something. And it happened that during that time, I was Senator Mary Landrieu's chief of staff. And so it's always fun for me to see the work that we did to get this transfer turn into real programming because it is something very special. We also encourage you to stop at the bookstore outside, East City Books, which is a local bookshop here from our neighborhood, which has delighted bibliophiles for the last 8 years under the tutelage of Lori Gilman, who is the founder and owner of the operation. So please, Mr. Hantman has graciously agreed to sign the books. So when you buy your book at the end, you can get an autograph. And I want you to be sure that some of you are new to the Hill Center. Some of you may be new to the United States Capitol Historical Society. There's information about the United States Capitol Historical Society. If you love Alan Hantman's talk, you will love our work on public history. And so we are very grateful for you being here. We hope you'll sign up for our newsletter as well. And what we're going to do tonight, it's going to be really fun because Alan Hantman, the 10th architect, the 10th architect of the Capitol. Now, that means only 10 people have had that responsibility. Do you understand? The architect of the Capitol is responsible for the Capitol, the Botanical Gardens, the Supreme Court, the Library of Congress, all of those buildings and all the activities, the security and everything else, which is designed in his book. And he will be interviewed by our Executive Vice President, Samuel Holliday, who probably there are few people who love the Capitol as much as Sam. Sam grew up in the neighborhood and has been doing tours for us and has grown and grown and grown in his responsibility for the Capitol Historical Society. So it'll be a real treat to hear that interview. There are question cards that we're going to pass around so that after you listen to Mr. Hantman, or even while you're listening, you can write a question and we'll collect them and Sam will guide those. So, enough about me. On with the show. Mr. Hantman.
Thank you, Jane. Wow. Thank you, Jane, and thank you to the Capitol Historical Society and the Hill Center. I'm one of those newbies. First time that I'm here, and it's a joy to see how this facility serves the community and really does so much that adds a whole nother level of activity and perspective to life over here. To have a derelict building go wasting without being able to turn it into new uses. Historic preservation is what we're all about, and clearly what this facility is all about. So thank you for all being here, and if I may, I'd also like to thank my friend of 49 years was it 59 years, Razi? I don't know, I'm losing track. June 19th, in 2 weeks, I guess it's 59 years that she's put up with me. And without her perspective, without her patience, without her intelligent criticism, this book would not exist. And I probably wouldn't have been architect of the Capitol. And I'd like to also thank my daughter Juliana, who is here tonight, because without her perspicacity, that's a good word to remember, we wouldn't have a publisher in Georgetown University Press, a wonderful academic press. And we went through years of editing and rewriting and all. So it's a joy to be together to celebrate it with all of you folks. And it's not often that an author recommends that folks start reading a book from the back. But that's exactly what I suggest. I recommend starting with the acknowledgments section, which honors the hundreds of people named there as representatives of the thousands of Architect of the Capitol employees who dedicated years, sometimes decades of their careers, working under challenging conditions as stewards of America's treasures on Capitol Hill. Conditions that were shaped by the pressure points of power within the Congress. And if you read the newspapers or watch television today, you can see that those pressure points are fairly intense and unfortunately growing. I couldn't be prouder of the architects, the engineers, the construction managers, the contractors who helped design and build the Capitol Visitor Center, increasing the Capitol by 70%, the largest expansion in 230 years. It's a magnificent challenge. And Under the Dome could only have been written through the commitment of these dedicated AOC staff, these professionals, some of whom are here this evening. This is almost a mini reunion for so many people who have come back to share what they've experienced together, and we put up with and surmounted on Capitol Hill in the face of some difficult objections. You could assume, rightly so, that we have members of Congress elected from all sections of our Capitol, all sections of our country. They have different perspectives, whether it's on nationality, on religion, on politics and all. And to get unanimity or to get consensus where you can move ahead with a project, especially if a project of this magnitude, is a very difficult challenge. So if I can figure out how to move this ahead, there we go. I love this image. I remember when I was interviewing for the job as Capitol way back in 1837 or something like that, it seems. The outline of the dome, actually it couldn't have been 37 because this dome wasn't built until 1855, completed by 1860. But that was etched in my mind because as I emerged from Union Station, there in the arcade was this dome lit in the background. And that has always meant so much to me and to so much to all you folks who have contributed so much of your career to honoring and controlling it. In the foreground, you can see the doorway to democracy. That is the project which was called the Capitol Visitor Center, but as you may know, it really is much more than that. Half of the area in the Visitor Center is dedicated to the House, to the Senate, the Congressional Auditorium. Really half of the space in the Visitor Center is really congressional space as opposed to visitors related. But when you think about it, nobody in the Capitol would ever commit to a project that their adversaries would say was a political perk. So calling it a visitor center was a lot easier for them to do than to say that, by the way, we've got 85,000 square feet of expansion for the House, and the same thing for the Senate, and a congressional auditorium, and all those wonderful things, which actually are necessary. And anybody who's worked on Capitol Hill would know that. As Jane indicated, this is basically the campus. Not Capitol architect is not just the Capitol, which, by the way, in the foreground, you see that we're setting up for an inaugural ceremony, that quadrennial transfer of power in our presidential elections. You can see the Capitol Visitor Center under construction on the east side of the Capitol, the Supreme Court, Senate office buildings, House office buildings, Library of Congress, 18 million square feet of space, some 500 acres of land. It's an amazing and difficult challenge. This is a wonderful image that the Capitol Historical Society developed in 1993, celebrating the 200th anniversary of the laying of the cornerstone by George Washington in 1793. In fact, the image on the bottom is the design for the Capitol that George, I'm on first name basis with him, selected over there for its grandeur, for its beauty, for its simplicity. But the dome, which is modeled after the Pantheon in Rome, was never built, but the wings were. In 1829, Charles Bulfinch, the third architect of the Capitol, built that dome, which was called an upside-down kettle, because he bowed to President Monroe's design and directive to say, make it taller so they can see it from further on. But this dome only lasted 25 years because it was built of wood, built of copper, and it leaked like a sieve. So from 1800 to 1849, 7 states were added to the Union, and the number of members of Congress increased from 138 to something like 292. They needed expansion space. And Thomas Eustick Walter was selected as the architect to add on to the original design of the Capitol building. And he took the initiative to design a new dome, which would fit proportionately on that new base, which was 750 feet long instead of 400 feet long. So part of the whole basis of what we're talking about tonight is continuity. It's the ability to recognize that we all build on the shoulders of those who've gone before us. And that certainly is true. This is the dome, the rendering that Thomas Eustick Walter prepared. And you could see men in top hat, women with parasols, carriages. It was the focal point of activity in Washington, D.C. And a magnificent dome, which he did this drawing, and within 4 months, $100,000 was appropriated by the Congress, which is a record landmark. Of course, by the time the dome was completed, it cost $1,060,000, a little bit over the original number quoted. But who's complaining right now? Maxwell House Coffee. Anybody remember Maxwell House Coffee over there? My problem was that that dome leaked. Even Thomas Eustick Walter's dome leaked. And to try to get the Congress to appropriate funds to replace the cast iron that had fallen off, to seal the leaks over the overlapping cast iron plates that comprise the dome. I took this can to a Capitol hearing, and instead of coffee, we collected rust from the dome and the Tholos level up at the top of the building. And I basically passed it out to the members in judgment up on the dais, saying, gentlemen, there were no women at that time. That's changing very rapidly. You hold the dome in your hands. They saw it, they respected it, but they didn't pass the money that I needed to repair it. But they did tack on the $7 million we needed to do the investigation. And this is the dome in 1958. And you could see the expansion of the east front of the Capitol. The cornerstone was dedicated by President Eisenhower. And you can see what happened on the east front of the Capitol. No respect for the affront to everybody's image of the Capitol building itself. 350 cars. George White, my predecessor, had suggested that we build an underground visitor center over here, eliminate the parking, and create a forecourt that was really respectful of the Capitol building itself. Part of the reason was, of course, visitors. Visitors would wait for 2 or 3 hours out in the sun trying to get in to see their house, the people's house. But that wasn't the major reason. The major reason that people in the Capitol could justify appropriating funds for it was security. We're all reminded, certainly, of January 6th and a different level of security. This was almost a day of innocence back in 1998 when 2 police officers were murdered within the Capitol. And because of that, Mr. Gingrich felt it was appropriate that we pass a bill for $100 million, but we raise $100 million from private sources. A group headed by the Pew Foundation headed up that effort, but they stalled out at $39 million. And they stalled out because we couldn't give naming rights. We couldn't make it, instead of the Congressional Auditorium, we couldn't make it the Bob Hope Memorial Auditorium or things like that. So folks want their names on things that they donate $10 million to. So it was security that was the major reason that we could do that. But $39 million is as far as the Pew Foundation got with their fundraisers until this happened. You remember September 11th. This is the route of the 4th plane. 2 of them hit the World Trade Center in New York, 1 of them the Pentagon. The 4th plane heading out to San Francisco, was hijacked, turned around, and was heading back towards the Capitol. They were 18 minutes away before the heroes took that plane down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And with that, people had their interest in a new visitor center and security reinvigorated. In fact, at that point in time, what we had been building as future expansion space for the Senate and the House became now expansion space. And this is the hearing room, the rendering of the hearing room we have in the House expansion space right now. Had to change the structural engineering, had to change the mechanical engineering, we had to do a lot of changes to the central mechanical systems to make this happen, and on the Senate side. But those were the changes that they felt safe to do after 9/11 occurred. I always say that the visitor center project was really 2 projects, and the easy part was building the building. The more difficult part was, what do you put in the building? Whose version of history do you say? What perspective do you promote? And you can see there are revisionist people out there that change the history of what really happened on January 6th. Well, they've been doing that all along and trying to change the history of what really happened with our country, and that millions of people will learn what they want us to learn. So going through that project of creating, this is a touchable model of the dome itself, which is wonderful. There's a classroom now in the exhibition hall where classes can go in and debate bills, learn what it means to have a Congress that is free and where your vote matters. And that's really the bottom line that we really were aiming for over here, to have this visitor center be not just a place where you go in, buy a few trinkets and go home, but you can learn about our government, how the laws are made, how important it is for our democracy that you're involved as part of that. But let's talk about the building of the building now. What we see here in that yellow dotted line is the outline of what became the Capitol Visitor Center. We were told to make it as big as possible, and we were limited by the building itself on the west, by the Olmsted landscape on the east. And so that's what we were digging to make happen. And this is the design layout, where you could see from East Capitol Street at the bottom, recreating the alley of trees that were created when the building was originally built, a new paved plaza when we first designed it, people were saying we can't do skylights because that would interfere with the view of the Capitol building. Those are very low. I don't know how many of you folks have seen the skylights, but they really make this underground visitor center a bright and cheery facility, which would never have been possible otherwise. So I'm saying, look at those big blue squares over there. Those define Emancipation Hall down below. And the other squares in those green areas are skylights that light up the marshalling area before people go on tours, and the expansion area for the House and the Senate. This is a rendering. Continuing East Capitol Street to the Central Rotunda steps, you could see the alley of trees meant to rebuild what had died out over the 100 years since the tulip poplars were planted in 1880s, and a ramp. What you also see here is a symmetry. What thou doest for the Senate, thou must doest for the House. So there's symmetry throughout everything that you see in the Capitol visitors. You see a ramp there. There's a ramp on the Senate side. There's an alley of trees. There's another one over there. All of it around the east-west line that goes right through the central rotunda and the dome. At the bottom of that ramp, you see the screening area where you're actually able to come from the west side, east side, and go through that screening area to come out on a mezzanine which overlooks what was originally called the Great Hall, but it became Emancipation Hall because the Librarian of Congress, Dr. Billington, said, I have a Great Hall across the street, you can't build another one, so you've got to rename it something else, and the name of Emancipation Hall appropriately came out, and there's a memorial in this hall commemorating the work of the slave laborers who helped build the Capitol. This is between the two orientation theaters. 4 months into my tenure as architect, Senator Akaka of Hawaii came to my office and said, the original model for the Statue of Freedom that sits on the dome is actually in the basement of the Dirksen Senate Office building. Plan a space for it over here. And we changed what was a monumental stairway leading up to the Capitol. We split it in half, raised the ceiling height, increased the floor loading, and made this the focal point of Emancipation Hall and the visitor center as people come in. And it's a wonderful, wonderful image. And behind it is where the exhibition hall is. And it's a wonderful element where people hopefully learn about their government and how important it is to everybody to be good citizens. Next to the Capitol, we excavated within 6 feet of the 230-year-old foundation walls. And if you don't think that I had sleepless nights wondering if that building was going to slide into the 70-foot deep hole, that was one of my fears over there. But what you see in those block dots are like 130-foot long screws that were screwed basically under the foundation of the Capitol as we excavated the earth in these pre-poured walls. And as each layer went down, more of those screws, those foundation bolts, went in to make sure that that wall was not impacted by the load of the Capitol. Very interesting. Look at the scale, 70 feet built within 6 feet of the fully occupied and being used Capitol building. Better sense of the 60,000 truckloads of earth that we excavated from this facility in order to build a 3-story underground facility. And what you see in the center over there, those bars at the center of the rotunda steps, is where they originally had talked about in that 1958 drawing of having an underground garage with 500 cars, and people would enter the Capitol through those areas. We knocked out the 2 central areas, and that's where the escalator and the stairs come in to make a wonderful transition between this underground facility and the Capitol building itself. On either side of that central rotunda carriageway is an archway where the carriages used to drive through. You can still do that on the Senate side and on the House side, but those are glazed now. So as you enter the building, you're having light come down. You can see the wing for the House, the wing for the Senate, and you are welcomed into the Capitol in a respectful way. Here's a closer shot of that entryway, and those two central piers were removed, and you can see the roof coming on for the excavation. United States Capitol is a focal point for so many of our national issues. You know about gold medal ceremonies. You know about lying in state, lying in honor ceremonies that take place over here. I had the honor of welcoming Mother Teresa to the Capitol for a gold medal ceremony. I had the honor to have her shake my hand because they said she was just out of the hospital, very frail. So just extend your hand to her. Don't shake her hand. She put one hand under mine, second hand under mine on top, bowed her head, and I felt a surge of energy from this holy woman. Beautiful, beautiful. And then she withdrew, went on to the next person in the greeting party. And that's one of my most beautiful memories of being architect of the Capitol, having the honor of greeting Mother Teresa and other dignitaries to the Capitol building itself. This is an image of the 2001 inaugural scene. As you folks know, Washington doesn't often warn you when snow showers or weather of various kinds are coming in. This occurred the night before the inaugural. 30,000 seats over there, all of the inaugural stands, which are under the responsibility of the architect of the Capitol. We had to call in the National Guard to shovel all of this, clean it up for the next morning when the inaugural ceremony went on. And it was the inauguration of George W. Bush. 2 weeks before, Al Gore was counting the ballots for the electoral votes that had already been certified by the 50 states. But as you remember, there was something called hanging chads in Florida, and there were many people who were excluded from the rolls over there, and the 25 votes for Florida went to George W. Bush instead of Al Gore, and the Supreme Court basically foreclosed the ability of Gore to carry on. So he graciously stood there and talked about how I will support the new president coming in, and I will make sure that he gets all the support he needs for the good of our country. This was not the first time that we had such a divisive thing happen. This guy, President Lincoln, back in 1860, won an election, and Vice President Breckinridge was in the same position of counting the electoral votes to confirm Mr. Lincoln's election. And there was talk about the Virginia militia coming in and making sure that this counting never happened. But there was a general from Virginia who was loyal to his oath of office, who surrounded the building and said that he would not let anybody come in to stop that counting of the votes. And one of the secessionist senators from Texas said, "Okay, are you going to tell me you're going to arrest a senator for coming to object?" He said, "No, I'll blow him to hell." That was what we really needed, I guess, on January 6th. There was no protection happening. There was nobody there to essentially give orders to the Capitol Police, and they were poorly armed and poorly prepared to protect the quadrennial turnover in the election of our president. This is what the Capitol Visitor Center looks like now. You see those skylights over there, the walkways coming down. The Capitol basically was not touched. We had two landmarks to deal with. One of them was the Capitol, to be true to it, to make sure that historic preservation was true to the whole image of the Capitol building, and also the landscaping, Frederick Law Olmsted. And we did that working with Olmsted's eggs, turning what were driveways into ramps, and showing respect to essentially what was there historically. This is the view from East Capitol Street, where now lying in honor, lying in state corteges would come and approach the Capitol building. Took a long time for this book to come out. It was a very difficult time frame that everybody I worked with who is here now knows. A divisive Congress, but not as divisive as what we have today. So I would hope that the thing that will make us safe, make the Capitol safe, is really not more security. It's really bringing people together, having people respect each other's perspective, to work things out, to compromise, to create an atmosphere where our union will live on for hundreds of more years. Thank you. This is not on either.
Here, I think. Here. One moment. My colleagues are passing out question cards. Testing 1, 2. Okay, that one's good. And so, if you have questions for us, please feel free to jot them down. Raise a hand. My colleague can bring them to you. Oh, darn. You see here, I thought I had. Sounds like I'm getting a little bit.
You did magic on mine, I guess. No,
Clearly,
this one work over here?
I'm
This
of-
is good? Okay.
Oh, here, we can pass it back and forth. How about that? Teamwork makes the dream work. Well, thank you for. Ooh, there we go. Thank you for. Nope, they're both. Okay, thank you.
They're both work. This one's working?
Can you hear me now? There, a little
We
bit.
can
Yes,
sing a
great.
duet.
There we go. Exactly. I should have warmed up. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I know we're starting to get the question cards in, and please feel free to keep them rolling. But I'd like to take a point of, interviewer privilege. There are so many fascinating things from your background, Mr. Hantman. Before you were appointed architect of the Capitol, you were responsible for the preservation and maintenance of Rockefeller Center. Could you speak a little bit what that transition was like, going from an iconic private building, which is still very public, to a government building also of significant historical value?
That's a very rational question. Rockefeller Center. Is this too noisy, or is that okay now? Rockefeller Center in New York had 15 million square feet of space, had its own police force, had millions of visitors every year. The parallels between what we have here on Capitol Hill and Rockefeller Center were significant. A major difference between the two was clearly Rockefeller Center was in theory a for-profit organization. If you were given a mandate by the leadership of Rockefeller Center Management Corporation, you'd march forward, keep them apprised of what was happening, let them know what you needed, why changes needed to be done, what the problems were, and they would say, fine, you've explained it to me, let's go ahead. It doesn't work that way on Capitol Hill. Especially, I think the new architect who's coming in on supposedly the 20th of this month, Mr. Austin, who spent 30 years in, he's an engineer rather than an architect, and he spent 30 years in the service. There are 12 committees that Mr. Austin will report to. You need 7 out of the 12 to agree to what you want to do before you can move ahead with anything. Getting one committee to agree to what you want to do is difficult enough, and those who we work together know that that's really the case. You've got the House appropriators, you've got the Senate appropriators, and they're the bottom line. You have the leadership of the House, the leadership of the Senate, both parties. You've got the Administration and Rules Committee. You've got all of these committees, and every one of them has a say in what the architect of the Capitol does. If we had a change order from a contractor on the job, we would have to go through both appropriation committees to get money that had already been slated for the project to get them to release it to do it, which is why talk about schedule, you talk about budget. When I originally talked about the visitor center at open hearings, I predicted that it would open in 2009 because of all of the approvals, because of all of the concerns that I would have with each of the sources in the House and the Senate. And it actually opened in December of 2008. but they expected it to be opened in 2005, which was totally unrealistic, and it created basically an Achilles heel for our project because contractors wouldn't even bid on it. We only had 2 contractors bidding on the project because of the constricted time frame. So when you talk about comparisons between the private sector and about government, they're different animals.
To say the least, absolutely. My goodness. Well, I feel like we're always fortunate to speak with someone who's achieved a Herculean task. And building this visitor center with all of those oversight challenges, with all of those moving of goalposts, if I may, it's just my hat is off to you and the entire team that was able to put this together. There are some questions, as you might expect, and we're continuing to pull in those cards as you put them together. There are some questions about the visitor center building itself, including whether you found anything interesting when you dug 70 feet down along the east side of one of the most historic buildings, I would argue, in the United States.
We had a historic preservationist on staff watching anything that we might dig up. There was a cistern on the east front of the Capitol, which we documented before we ripped it apart and measured it and did that. And in the middle of the wall on the house side, just 6 feet from the Capitol, was a well. That well stopped construction in that area because of the very issue that this questioner brings up, historic preservation. It had been used when the first segment of the Capitol had been built back in 1800. So that was really the only thing that was found, because when Frederick Law Olmsted, have I got that right name?
Yeah.
When he essentially graded the east front of the Capitol, he used tens of thousands of yards of fill, replanted all the trees, and any arrowheads or whatever else he might have found over there was found or buried at that point in time. So we did not have major issues other than that well.
You love the lucky breaks. You love when, fortune's wheel rolls your way.
Right.
Another question that came in about the planning and building of the visitor center, this magnum opus, if I can be so bold as to call it that, for you, is, as I understand it, as the questioner understands, the visitor center was one of the first parts of the Capitol complex that was compliant with some of the various building codes. Might not be the right phrase, forgive me. My background is not in architecture, it's barely in history, but they put up with me. But things such as the ADA, OSHA, some of these regulatory efforts. Could you speak a little bit to how the visitor center perhaps changed the paradigm of what it meant to build at the Capitol complex and some of the effort you had to put in on that front as well? Good
question. As I think most of the folks in this room, you're somewhat educated. You know that there's a legislative branch, an executive branch, a judicial branch. The legislative branch does not have to do what the executive branch mandates. Or what the District of Columbia mandates in their local governments. So any codes, any criteria, whether it's ADA or anything like that, does not apply to the legislative branch unless you choose to do so. We chose to do so, which is why we were totally compliant with the ADA and beyond. The elevators that you see in the visitor center make it totally accessible. We had people go through it from the community, the disabled community, and they gave us plaudits and kudos on having complied. In terms of safety, life safety and all, after 9/11, when we got the mandate to build the expansion space for the House and the expansion space for the Senate, we created those as separate buildings from the visitor center element. And if you saw some film of some of the marauders, insurrectionists on January 6th coming into the Capitol, there's a fireproof wall and a roll-down door that divides the visitor center from the Capitol building itself. So in essence, you've got four different buildings, 4 different codes, 4 different exit criteria, and we complied with all of them. So we set that as a criteria, but as the legislative branch of government, whoever is now going to be the AOC or do construction, in theory, does not have to comply with executive branch criteria.
That's fascinating, and what, again, just further reason to be so grateful for all that you and the whole architect's office did to put that together. I've got one, it's a fun one, it's, a question
We'll take a
that
fun
might, we like to pepper in, we like to have fun here. I'd like to know, as this questioner writes, where is the cornerstone? Deceptively simple in its question.
George White, my predecessor, who served for 24 years, searched for that for a long time. Essentially, after the building was burned in the War of 1812, the British, those folks who are our friends now across the ocean, they burned our capital in 1814. And in the rebuilding of the capital, they were searching for the cornerstone also. But they rebuilt and changed things to the point where George White thought he found the right cornerstone, but until you had the silver plate that went under the cornerstone to confirm that that's the one, you couldn't officially say that you really found it. And I would tend to think that over a couple hundred years, that silver has deteriorated to the point where you couldn't find it anyway. So nobody, it was the southwest corner of the House of Representatives first wing, in theory, where that cornerstone was supposed to be, but nobody really has found it.
The mystery continues. If there are any aspiring Indiana Jones, Robert Langdons, or some of the other mystery characters out there, you might want to talk to us after today's program. I'd like to take a step back and ask a couple of questions about the role as architect. I've heard it described as being the mayor of one of the most chaotic cities in America. You mentioned in the book that you have 541 different companies, offices, organizations in the 541 elected members of Congress. Quick math, 100 senators, 435 voting representatives, 6 non-voting delegates. I also was not a math major, but I appreciate the knowing nods out there. Could you speak a little bit to what it was like having to provide for the physical upkeep, the preservation of this beautiful and important complex, while also dealing with the chaos of, I know you talked about it a little bit already, but if you could delve a little more into that balancing act, that tightrope you had to walk.
I remember one of the committees, it was the House Rules and Administration Committee. The chairman of that committee was named Bob Ney. You may remember he went to jail for having used Indian funds from the Abramoff scandal and all that. He called himself the mayor of Capitol Hill. And basically, we reported to him. We reported to a similar committee, the Senate Rules Administration Committee on the Senate side. They were really our primary overseers, aside from the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader and all of the minority leaders as well. In reality, there were very, very well said 541. Yes, Eleanor Holmes Norton is one of those two, although she can't vote on the floor of the House, she can vote in committee. So all of those folks, in fact, Eleanor Holmes Norton called me to her office after I was there for about 6 months or so and wanted me to support the local community boards overseeing all of the projects that the architect of the Capitol did. And I apologized and I said, I don't have that power. It's basically the legislative branch separated from the executive branch. And you know the city paper, you've seen that come out every now and again? I was panned in the city paper. Half of that paper ripped apart the architect of the Capitol, and all the disgruntled employees of the AOC had their say in that paper because I could not support her. I didn't have the power to support her to make bills or anything like that. So the reality is the AOC is in service to the Congress and the committees of the Congress. And sometimes they make life very difficult for us, but we don't appropriate funds by ourselves. We need to have appropriated funds to accomplish anything. So the architect of the Capitol is not the mayor. Hopefully he's a good steward, or she is a good steward of the Capitol and our history, not just for the Congress, but for the people of this country. And that's why I fear that people who come in who don't feel the historic preservation issues, don't feel the responsibility to create our historic landmarks, might bow to some of the things that members of the Congress say who are trying to do things unfortunately sometimes at the minimal cost, as opposed to recognizing that what we build is there for generations to come.
That was really beautifully said, Mr. Hantman. I think and you really kind of answered one of the questions I was going to ask about another tightrope walk, another balance of preservation and continuing operations. I think that's part of what's so exciting for so many people, especially I know my colleagues at the Capitol Historical Society, and I'm sure our friends in the architect's office, is that excitement of working in such an historic space that is still doing the job today. But let me pose another kind of fun potpourri type question. You talked about, if I may, your sort of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington moment. You get to Union Station, you see the dome through the colonnade, and you have that experience. The Capitol is also a touchstone of pop culture. Were there any fun pop culture moments during your tenure as architect, or do you have any recollections from times outside of our normal sort of inside the Beltway excitement where you might have gotten to
I don't know if we'd call it pop culture. I talked about Mother Teresa. I talked about the honor of helping officiate at lying in state ceremonies and lying in honor ceremonies for the police officers that were murdered, of having an annual Christmas tree lighting ceremony and being the host for that each year on the west front of the Capitol. I remember my first year on that Christmas tree lighting. Interesting, because at Rockefeller Center, I also took part in the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree ceremony, where David Rockefeller would come down and press the button, and on national television, that tree would light up at Rockefeller Center. Here, when I got here, Newt Gingrich had kind of deigned that it was now a holiday tree. It wasn't a Christmas tree. It was the issue of the times, how politically correct you want to be, how nice. And my own staff basically were rebelling against that, and they wanted it to go back to what it in fact is, which is a Christmas tree. So for the first lighting of that Christmas tree, Matthew Evans, who was our landscape architect at the Architect of the Capitol, goes out each year to a national forest and selects the Christmas tree. And he selects it based on the fact that it's got sun all around, the branches are very nicely spread out and uniform. It can hold decorations which are donated by the state. This was South Dakota, the first one coming in. And the problem was every prior architect had lit the tree when it was connected by cables. You know, the type you plug in to get your lawnmower going. 100 yards up Capitol Hill to a vault, an electrical vault. And I said, Matthew, I don't feel too good. It rained last night. People have been walking around the tree all day long. Is this thing going to light? He said, well, it lit last night. So I said, Matthew, he said, for 36 years, Mr. Hantman, it's worked. No problem whatsoever. I do, as the master of ceremonies, I introduce the senators from South Dakota and the people. They go through their greetings, the National Park Service talks, and then I introduce a fellow named Newt Gingrich, who is the Speaker of the House. Newt comes up to the podium where the button exists. He calls up his nieces and nephews. The Pershing's Own, the band, is playing their music. They finish the Christmas songs. Newt turns to his nephews and nieces, says, on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Nothing happened. He turns and looks at me. He can look at you, Newt Gingrich. 1, 2, 3. They try again. Nothing happened. I turned to the band and said, play another song. And my staff went running up, going into the vault, trying to find out what had happened. Finally, after the third song, in the middle of that song, the tree lit. Magnificent, beautiful. Newt turns around with his children, walks up to the tree, and it was mighty quiet under the tree after he and his Christmas party went to his office. His office, by the way, had a Tyrannosaurus Rex head in it, if you didn't know that. It was a skeleton that he took from one of our museums. When I walked into that room with Razi after coming up through the soggy grass and up Olmsted's beautiful stairways, he just said, "Do the right thing, Mr. Hantman." And the right thing, I think, was to fire Matthew Evans and some other things like that, but wasn't his fault. I didn't have Matthew check it another time. But that was one of my heart-rending experiences. Now there's an underground cable connecting the spot where the Christmas tree comes on up. I batted 9 for 10 successful tree lightings during my term.
Absolutely. The Nationals could use a batter with that kind of average. I want to ask one more sort of question about the role as architect before we get into a little bit about the book and then let everyone go storm the plates of cookies and wine and soft drinks in the back room. And that gets a little bit to that, what you just mentioned with Speaker Gingrich having the Tyrannosaurus fossil. There's an awful lot of art and artifacts that are both in the collection of the architect's office, in the House and Senate collections, and the other government collections here in DC that wind up circulating through the Capitol building, I'm sure. And I'm just curious, do you have any fun stories? And a Tyrannosaurus skull is tough to beat, but are there any other fun recollections from your time as architect of curating and managing such a vast and varied collection of art and managing its care?
We had a curator's office who did an excellent job of managing and preserving all of the artwork over there. One of the pieces of artwork that you folks may be familiar with was my predecessor, George White, retired before he fulfilled the mandate of Congress to take the suffrage statue from the crypt of the Capitol and move it up to the rotunda. I had the blessing of moving 14,000 pounds of solid stone up from the crypt into the rotunda itself. We hired a moving firm. The moving firm projected 11 hours or so. There were 29 people headed up by Ronaldo. Ronaldo started on a Friday night. By Saturday night, when it was supposed to have been finished, it was still down at the crypt level, ready to be hoisted up the stairway, and then rolled on tracks across the rotunda floor to the final place that it sits today. Finally, on Sunday evening, Ronaldo came to me and said, "We're only 5 feet away from the final resting place of the suffrage statue. What I'm going to do is I'm going to swing it on this hoist and release the chains and let it float down onto the base." I said, "No, no, no, Ronaldo." That would have ended not only the beautiful, wonderful paintings on the wall, it would have sunk back down to the crypt level, ended my very short-lived career over there as architect of the Capitol. At 2 in the morning on Monday morning, after 31 hours, the Women's Suffrage Museum, the Women's Museum right next to the Hart Senate office building, those ladies were there for all 31 hours with their champagne bottles ready to pop. 2 o'clock in the morning on Monday morning, they popped the champagne. We settled it down, and that was the piece of artwork that is sitting there. By the way, when the Senate and House passed the law saying that we could move it into the rotunda, they said, for 1 year, then you find another place to put it. I was supposed to set up a meeting after a year to find another place, and it's there forever. We're never moving that again.
Hear, hear. Oh my goodness, what an adventure. Well, a couple of quick questions about the book. Someone who I think has done their homework and read ahead here asks about who are the elves and shoemakers, and why do you use that analogy?
I would like to find out myself. I've not heard about the elves and shoemakers. I don't know what homework this person
Perhaps.
did, but please explain it to me.
Please.
I've heard of a lot of things like wild cats going through or bullet holes that never existed. It was the rusting out iron in some of the stonework, but don't know anything about elves, and I'm not going to make it up right now.
Fair enough. Please consult the syllabus next time before you proceed with your homework. There are, I'm sure, we have something of an idea to collect some of our overheard, shall we say, less than accurate histories, like the demon cat, like the bullet holes, and some of the rest.
Right.
Do you have any doozies from your time besides those couple of big ones? The Titanic chandelier also comes to mind.
I don't know. I've probably spoken about most of the wonderful ones that I've had. I'm not sure about, oh yeah, what's that guy's name who writes all those books about?
Is that Dan Brown?
Dan
Lost
Brown.
Symbol?
Yeah. If you read Dan Brown's book, which talks about the Capitol, he talks about walking into the, and he has a hand in the rotunda, and he goes and builds off, and he talks about secure hidden areas underneath, which never existed, basically. Where those escalators and stairs come up is basically where those storage rooms essentially were at the bottom. So Dan Brown took a little artistic license with what he wrote in his book.
Sorry to burst anyone's bubble there. Though I'm sure you can find the Dan Brown books at East City alongside some other slightly more accurate representations as well. One last question about the book, and then we'll do the final question, big philosophical, feel-good kind of question. But the book question is, you talked about the effort it was to put this book together, the, of course, wonderful, loving support of Rozzy and your family. Did you have to go through some kind of approval process? Did you have to, consult with outside parties in order to get this book published, besides, of course, editors and publishers? Did you have to run this through any chains of command, let's say?
I think it was basically personal experience. As anybody in this room who I worked with knows how difficult it is to work with the Congress. At the end of my 10-year term, the Visitor Center was not yet quite finished. Stephen Ayers, basically, I don't know, Stephen, are you here? Stephen Ayers, the 11th architect of the Capitol, did the punch list, finished off on a lot of the things, the fire and life safety security issues that needed to be finished. But the press, whether it was roll call, whether it was The Hill, whether it was Washington Post, clearly, when you've increased the budget tremendously, when you have not fulfilled the inauspicious expectations of finishing it by 2005, and it basically all the approvals and changes occurred, there was a lot of criticism coming in the way of the architect of the Capitol. And I saw as my major responsibility to get the Visitor Center done was to take the heat instead of the people who had come up with schedules that didn't work, did estimates that didn't work, basically because of the changes that Congress implemented. So I had some, I don't know if you'd call it anger, but angst to work out of my personal experience. And when I started writing, I was justifying what happened and why it happened. Until I got to the point where I said, you know something? This is something we have to celebrate. We got it done. You talked about this as a miracle to get a quality facility which is now accepted as an integral part of Capitol Hill, and everybody takes it for granted, and the 25 million people who visited all love it. They're treated with respect. That's what I had to come around to talk about celebrating the experience and the people I worked with, and that's what I tried to do.
Hear, hear. Absolutely. That's absolutely. I think it's safe to say that not only were the goalposts moved, but you and your team put it right through the uprights there. So to go out on I mentioned a sort of big picture, feel-good philosophical question. Someone asks what words of wisdom and advice you can give to someone just starting out in the architect's office, in the agency. What guidance would you provide to the young professionals in the room?
Be true to yourself. That's really the issue. We reported to a legislative branch appropriations subcommittee chair who wanted to change the stone to sheetrock, wanted to eliminate all of the quality finishes that we had, told me basically don't listen to any members of Congress for what they want to do or change over here. You've got to save money, you've got to cut. There are always going to be the members of Congress who come in and want to rise up the ladder from a freshman to a sophomore, be a leader ultimately. And sometimes they're going to want to get press. And it may not be positive press, it may be negative press. The architect of the Capitol is an easy target. He can't fight back. And that's one of the few pieces of advice that George White, my predecessor, gave me. He said, Alan, develop a thick skin because you cannot fight back. You cannot be at a hearing where you debate a member sitting up on the dais over there. So what I can say is be true to yourself, bite your tongue when you have to bite your tongue, but try to do the right thing for the American people.
God love you. Alan Hantman, thank you so much for taking... Thank you so much, everyone. There are refreshments in the next room. East City Books, I'm sure, is still out there ready to sell you a copy of this incredible book. Please buy it, please read it, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
He gets 10%.